Kamusta? I'm Elsie. Welcome to the Roundtable podcast. We've created the space for Ni Vanuatu women to speak freely on issues affecting us today. Let's navigate life in the islands together. Join me as I speak to a new guest every episode and ask the questions you've always wanted to ask. Ale, Yumistorian. This project is made possible with the support of the We Rise Coalition and PACMAS. Did you know that in the early 20th century, Vanuatu was under the colonial rule of both the British and the French? Now, both very different countries introducing many things such as education, religion, and of course later technology. All very important things, but at what cost? On this episode, we unpack the impact colonialism has had on Vanuatu and how the current generation is steering it into the future. Joining me on this episode is Josepheen Tarianga. Josepheen is the Communications and Advocacy Coordinator for the We Rise Coalition. For those of you who don't know, We Rise is a feminist coalition made up of 6 feminist organizations across the Pacific, and Sister is part of it. Josepheen is also studying law and journalism at the University of the South Pacific here in Port Vila. She has delved in numerous resources throughout her studies that focus on the topic that we're going to be exploring on this episode. And if you know Josepheen, you know she's very passionate about issues that are important to her and her community, and she's always ready to speak about it. Hi, Josepheen.
Hi, Elsie.
Thank you for joining me at the round table. Colonization. It has had such a huge influence on Vanuatu and where we are as a country. There were the explorers, the traders, the missionaries, and of course, the Anglo-French condominium government. From your perspective, what are some of the ways colonization has affected us?
Wow, that's a big question. But I think that some of the main things that immediately come to mind would be the way that we value formal education in comparison to cultural education, religion and its place in our lives, as well as its beliefs as a pillar of social norms. And I think a major one to me would be language. So the use of language is so powerful, and to this day and age, you can still see our colonial past in the way that we use language. We have over 80 indigenous languages throughout Vanuatu, but our 3 national languages are Bislama, English, and French. And to this day, we're still trying to incorporate Bislama into formal learning education. But the use of language itself today, so when we use descriptive words like stilwul hair or local or island, and something very harsh but black saucepan, they have negative implications to them. While if I say, I'm a big mania or master or boss, that's something that will indicate that that is an important person or it's high praise. And if I say, that girl, like, one Mrs. or wow, Mrs., it's, you use it to describe a girl that's like really pretty, and often they have Eurocentric features or they have a Eurocentric air about them. So the use of language in itself too is a big thing that makes it, is a big way that colonialism has impacted us. But also the clash of the private ownership system and a more community-based way of living. So colonialization brought in that system, and we see in a work the Oceanian lifestyle of communal living, where the islanders wanted to assimilate them and their property, while the explorers believed in private ownership. And to this day, you see that there's still a struggle between individualism and a more community-centric way of living.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I see that in the urban setting, that individualism and expression of self is more apparent in the urban communities than the communities in the rural areas. And I think we're just treading in the footsteps that were already set for us. We developed these hubs in the areas that the condominium government had already advanced. So I think with the introduction of the many new Western concepts that they brought with them, it's as if they felt they had to dilute our culture to make room for them. And I know that in the older generation, culture was the cornerstone of their lives. It was what they revolved around, and it was something that they then passed on to the next generation through Storian or Talanoa. And I feel like today, and it's sad to say, but it doesn't hold the same value. My dad, he can speak my language fluently. And it's sad to admit, but I can't speak my language. I know the most basic phrases, but if I was to have a full-on conversation from someone from my island, it's impossible. I can't have that with them. And the beautiful thing is, though, is I'm willing to learn and I want to learn because I know how valuable it is.
I think that, well, both my parents, they can speak the language, but I can't speak the language. I grew up in town, so I grew up in an urban setting, and that means that I wasn't exposed to my culture as much outside of family gatherings where people would gather and I would meet with my extended family and they would talk and they would share stories and they would speak in our language. But realistically, outside of the formal learning system, there is not a space where you can actually learn these things in the urban areas. So it's either you go back to the island to learn it, or you don't really have that opportunity to learn it, that privilege, because there's no space for it in our formal system. I know that a lot of children our age as well that live in the urban areas, they don't speak their languages either or have like a deep sense of understanding about our culture. But where would we find time for these Storians between like the rigorous curriculum and the education system and university, the workforce, adulthood? Like there isn't a set place for us to go and to learn these things. And the priorities have just shifted. It's you get a degree, you join the workforce, you make a change. Who immediately thinks how I develop my country is by learning my culture or doing subsistence farming, agriculture by going back to my island? Like that is a shift of mindset for all of us as well.
And if you think about it, we've been independent for less than half a century. There are people as old as we are independent, and in just one generation, we seem to have lost grasp of our language and cultural values. Josepheen, you wrote a lovely poem for MacFest earlier this year. I would love if you could share a bit about your poem, your inspiration behind it, and then I would love for you to read it for us.
I'm glad you liked it. So MacFest was a celebration of culture, and for me it was a time of reflection as well on my own culture and language and my grasp of it. I wrote a poem about it for my son, and I read that during the literary portion of the festival, which was House Storian. It was the first of its kind, and we were so privileged to have taken part in it. And so the poem is titled Lakwai Natungungwera, which means for my son in my language. I'm from Mumbai. I'm just going to read it out for you now. When I was 18, I knew 7 turns of phrase, 6 songs, and a handful of profanities in my mother tongue. I learned the songs when I was young. I now lull my son to sleep with them. He is 1 and I am 22. Now I know 12 turns of phrase, 7 songs, and more than a handful of profanities in my mother tongue. I find myself tithering on the edges of conversations that I should understand, but I do not understand. conversations that I am a part of but I am set apart from. Sometimes when my grandmother directs me, she repeats her directions several times in her dialect, each time motioning with her hands to help me understand. She gives up and switches to Bislama because my ears do not know the words of where I come from. I know how to say Rangarea, Bongarea, Lakua, Kelekele, Sihos, Vanua, Langua Maiko, but I do not yet know how to tell my grandparents, "Thank you so much for the sacrifices you have made, for the prayers you have prayed. We will be all the good things you have made us," in the dialect that raised my mother, who raised me. I am 22, and I am only now arriving at the importance of mastering the language that comes from where I come from, that ties me to the people that are my people, and the culture that is my culture. I refuse to give my son a second-hand dialect, an English that is not mine to give. I ask my mother to write out more songs in my mother tongue, so I can give them to my son when he is between me and sleep. I ask my aunties what the words mean, how to use them, and why some of the words from the east side are different from the west side. I feel foolish for learning so late, but I will be foolish if it means that the language will live on in me to my son.
Thank you, Josephine. That's such, honestly, I love that poem. Every time you hear it, I get like goosebumps. It's so great that you are taking that step to teach your son your culture while you yourself are on your own journey of learning. Why do you think it's important to make that time and effort to know your culture and your language and really embrace it?
I think that for me, it's important because when you know who you are, you can walk more confidently into the world around you because you know your values and you have your own belief system. So there's a sense of unwavering identity. I think the thing about culture and language is that it ties us to a place and a people so that we always have a community, a support system that will show up for us. So learning the language and the culture is where you can build your connection or your relation to your people so that you never have to be alone. When you're celebrating or when you're mourning a loss, you will always have that community. Yeah, I think that that's why it's so important.
Absolutely. And what are your hopes for the current and future Indigenous generations?
I have so much hopes for us and for the future generation, but when it comes to culture, what I hope for the current Indigenous generation is that I want us to be curious about our culture and to prioritize its learning. We should keep advocating for its importance and make the work to record it so that we can conserve it in all spaces, from education to the workforce to how we represent on an international level. My hope for the future Indigenous generation, though, is that there are established places to learn our culture and languages, and that our current generation has made that we work hard enough to make enough space for our whole cultural identity so that they have the privilege to learn it. I guess to sum it up, I want for both the current and the future generation to know what and who we are and to have the privilege of learning about us or where we come from.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's just getting that understanding and that wanting to value and wanting to learn about our culture and our language and embracing that as well. There's this short video of Ella Henry, who is a senior lecturer of Maori development at Auckland University of Technology. And it's a short video, but it's such a powerful video. She speaks about how since the 1960s and 1970s, there's been a movement that's happened in the Maori community. And the movement, it saw an increase in Maori activism and the struggle for self-determination, in the political sense, the economical sense, and culturally as well. And in the last 20 years, there's been this new generation that has emerged through the Maori education system. And she noted that, even though that this generation may not speak the language, they're willing and wanting to learn and to be on that journey of discovering, who they are and what they are. And they've identified that identity is crucial to cultural well-being. And I think that's so powerful. And she continues on and says, that this generation understands, how crucial it is to understand their identity, to understand their culture. And it is allowing them to move confidently and reinstate their cultural strengths. And I think we hope that our generation today and the future generation will recognize this. I feel like slowly our generation is recognizing it, and we're slowly building that movement. For instance, there's this great initiative that recently started up, and granted, it's specific to the island of MI, but it's a great example of how we can reclaim and embrace our culture and identity. The project is called Le Rio. I really hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If I'm not, I apologize. But the initiative started by Dr. Jimmy Obed, and I didn't know anything about it, but it popped up on my Facebook feed. And I went onto the page and I was looking through it, and it looks great. And I was looking at the aims that they have, or the aims of this particular project. And so they have 3 aims. 1, to create a safe space for young girls to learn and speak their language. 2, to allow the young girls to practice speaking the language without shame and without, feeling scared of making a mistake, which I think is great, because having, wanting to learn, your culture and your language is a whole challenge in itself. But when you have that community to back you up and be like, yes, this is important, this is something that you should value, and we're here to support you, I love that. So I really love this particular aim that they have. And then the last aim is to teach the young girls their community values. So I feel like this initiative just wraps up everything that we've, talked about today: embracing, learning your culture and the values behind it, and just, having that safe space to do it all. Just before we wrap things up, I would like to know, what are some ways that we can reclaim our culture, even in the smallest of ways?
For me, I find that the most practical ways that we can try to reclaim our culture is by staying curious. It's by asking questions when you don't know something, or when you don't know the meaning of a word, or when you're out of your capacity to understand certain things. Just ask. It's admitting that you don't know your language. You don't know the significance of this cultural ceremony. You don't know how you're related to this uncle or this auntie or this kid. And just asking about it. But the opportunity to ask is in the family gatherings. So another practical way is going to these family gatherings. I know that in this day and age, everybody is so busy. We have so many plans, but make that genuine effort to attend these things, these weddings, these deaths, these 100 days, these 5 days, or blocking ceremony, or other custom ceremonies. And if you don't know the significance of these ceremonies, ask. So curiosity is the most practical way to ask first, and then to attend these places so you have the opportunities to ask.
Thank you. Now, we're going to be doing a new thing where on each episode we ask our guests, what is the most important lesson you have learned as a woman navigating life in Vanuatu today?
It is okay to come off a little aggressive. I think that because as women in our society, we are expected to be docile, to be submissive. And when you have aspirations or when you have certain goals and you're willing to make the sacrifices to get there, sometimes it seems a little bit aggressive, but it's okay to come off a little aggressive because at the end of the day, as women in this society, we always have to do what feels like the most to get to certain places. And if, it's just saying, look, I see that it's going to be hard and I see that doing these things would mean that I will come off with a certain brashness. And it's not something that you should be doing intentionally, but if that's what takes you to where you have to go, it's okay. And it's going to be completely fine just to be accepting and open to the fact that not everybody's going to like you and what you do, and understanding that that is not your greatest aspiration in life and that is none of your business. I think that. And lastly, because you asked for one, but I'm going to give you two. And lastly, it's admitting that you don't know everything and being open to learn, because, when you're coming off as like, oh, I know everything, it takes away from your opportunity to learn. It takes away from other people's openness to teach. But when you're there and just, hands open, look, I don't know this, but I would like to know this, people are more willing to pour into you because they see that you're willing to be malleable enough to take on new things, to take on new learnings. So
thank you, Josepheen, for sharing your two most important lessons you've learned so far as a woman navigating life in Vanuatu. Thank you again for joining me for, this provoking discussion of understanding our culture and embracing our identity. That brings us to the end of this episode. We hope this episode was beneficial to you. As always, thanks for listening to The Roundtable. Make sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Sister Vanuatu and our website, sister.com.vu. This is Elsie from The Roundtable. If you want to hear more from The Roundtable podcast, make sure to tune in to the next episode.